made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia. It is my view that the deceitful way the interview was obtained substantially influenced what my mother said. It is my firm view that this panorama programme holds no legitimacy and should never be aired again.
Prince William broke through the blue wax seal on a vellum envelope that sat untouched since August 1997, and what his mother had written inside would spark a confrontation inside the British royal family that nobody at that palace was ready for. Diana didn't leave a goodbye message. She left a legal tool, precise, witnessed, and completely enforceable. Within hours of reading those 3 pages, William made a single photocopy and sent it to Clarence House. And the moment Camilla read the first 4 lines of her predecessor's handwriting, she canceled a national television interview, shut her office door, and called her lawyers. But here's the thing, the letter was never actually lost. It had been held deliberately by someone who spent nearly 30 years waiting for exactly the right moment to release it, and that changes absolutely everything about this story. Before we go any further, make sure you follow along because what Diana actually wrote and who protected it all these years is far more extraordinary than any headline could suggest. To understand why this letter carried the power to stop the palace dead in its tracks, we need to start with the morning William first held it in his hands. Prince William's dark blue Range Rover pulled into the stable courtyard at Althorp House on a cold, gray morning in late March 2026. He climbed out alone, no press announcement, no prepared statement. His security team hung back as he walked toward the heavy oak side door of the Spencer family home, and his uncle, Earl Charles Spencer, was already standing in the stone corridor waiting for him. The greeting wasn't exactly warm. It was quiet in that particular way. Serious moments become quiet. The kind of silence between 2 people who both understand that what's about to happen cannot be reversed. Earl Spencer skipped the pleasantries. He simply held up a small worn brass key attached to a faded red ribbon and gestured for William to follow him down the stairs. They walked past stored family portraits and crates of 19th century silver until they reached a temperature-controlled room at the far end of the basement. On a steel table in the center sat a small scarred leather writing case. The initials DS were stamped in gold foil near the handle, though the lettering had mostly worn away over the decades. Earl Spencer pointed to the case and explained that an estate solicitor had discovered it just 3 days earlier while clearing out an old filing cabinet in the estate's private legal office. The box hadn't been touched since September 1997. William took the brass key from his uncle, fitted it into the lock, and turned it until the mechanism released with a sharp metallic snap. He lifted the heavy leather lid. Inside the case sat a small stack of private photographs, an old leather-bound diary, and a single heavy vellum envelope sealed with blue wax. The wax carried the unmistakable imprint of Princess Diana's personal signet ring. On the front of the envelope, written in his mother's distinct sharp handwriting, was a single word: his name. William held the envelope for a long moment without moving. He turned it over and noticed a secondary stamp from a London courier firm on the back dated August 15, 1997. He signaled to his security officer to photograph the tracking number on a secure palace device before anything else was touched. The officer logged the entry into the Kensington Palace Security Registry, cross-referencing it against the official travel records from that exact week nearly 30 years earlier. The records confirmed that Diana's personal driver had made an unlisted journey from London to Althorp on that exact Friday afternoon, carrying a secure administrative pouch. The chain of custody was unbroken. The document hadn't been moved, copied, or opened since the day it was sealed. Earl Spencer walked out of the room to give his nephew privacy, pulling the heavy vault door closed behind him. William sat down on a plain wooden chair under the bare bulb hanging from the basement ceiling. He held the envelope in both hands, feeling the weight of the thick paper against his fingers. He hadn't yet broken the seal, but somewhere across the city, a chain of events had already begun, one that a group of people had been quietly waiting 30 years to trigger. William used the blade of his pocket knife to carefully slice through the blue wax, working slowly along the edge of the seal so the paper beneath wouldn't tear. He pulled out 3 pages of closely written text. The ink was a deep navy blue, the specific shade Diana reserved for her most private correspondence, written with the fountain pen she used when she didn't want anyone else to ever mistake her meaning. He read the date at the top of the first page, August 14th, 1997, just 17 days before the car crash in Paris. What he found wasn't a farewell letter. There were no emotional appeals, no expressions of love, no final message from a mother to her son. What Diana had written read more like a formal legal memorandum than a private note. That precision, that cold architectural clarity, hit harder than any grief-stricken goodbye could have. She hadn't written to him because she knew she was going to die. She had written to him because she had seen something coming and had decided with complete calm to build a wall around her children before it arrived. William read the first page slowly, then the second. His eyes moved at a steady pace, line by line, until they stopped completely at a section halfway down the second sheet that Diana had underlined so heavily the pen had nearly pressed through the vellum. She had laid out a precise set of binding conditions regarding the woman who would eventually marry King Charles. She had named her directly. She had specified, with the careful language of someone advised by her own legal team, that under absolutely no circumstances should that woman inherit, utilize, or publicly associate herself with the personal jewels, ancestral property, or ceremonial titles belonging directly to the Spencer family lineage. The restrictions weren't vague. They weren't emotional. They were the kind of language that a court could read without any confusion. William sat with the 3 pages on his lap for a long moment without moving. Then he reached back into the envelope to check whether anything remained inside. His fingers found something in the deeper fold of the lining, something small and solid. He turned the envelope over and shook it gently. A tiny object dropped into his palm. It was a gold charm, no larger than his thumbnail, shaped like a polo mallet. Engraved on its surface were 2 initials, D and W. He recognized it immediately. It had been part of a charm bracelet Diana wore constantly throughout his childhood at Kensington Palace. The kind of piece that a young boy notices because it catches the light when his mother reaches across a table or pulls him close. She hadn't included it by accident. There was no note explaining its presence. There didn't need to be. The charm was her signature in a language that no forger, no disgruntled archivist, no palace operative could have known or replicated. It told William, without a single additional word, that the hands which sealed this envelope belonged to nobody else on earth. He placed the charm carefully back inside and folded the 3 pages against his chest. To understand why Diana wrote those 3 pages, we have to go back to 1996. Not to Paris, not to the final summer. We have to go back to the divorce settlement, to the document that was supposed to close the chapter between Diana and the institution she had spent a decade fighting. The settlement was substantial, the financial terms were significant, but buried inside the legal framework was a clause that received almost no public attention at the time and which Diana's own advisors had flagged to her in private as a potential source of future conflict. Certain items from her personal collection, the Spencer tiara, several sapphire sets, a number of historic pieces that the public had come to associate almost entirely with her, weren't outright gifts. They were loans. Technically, they had been placed into the royal pool for Diana's lifetime use only. Upon her death, ownership was to revert automatically to a private family trust managed jointly by her brother and her 2 sons. The clause looked clean on paper. In practice, it depended entirely on the goodwill of whoever controlled the palace administration at the time it needed to be enforced. Diana didn't trust that goodwill, not because she was paranoid, but because she had spent 15 years inside the institution and understood precisely how it operated when an inconvenient legal boundary needed to quietly disappear. She had watched obligations dissolve. She had watched promises get reframed. She had watched the machinery of the palace absorb things that were supposed to remain outside its reach. She had no reason to believe that a property clause buried in a divorce settlement would survive the pressure of a new consort with institutional support and a team of advisors who knew exactly which levers to pull. So, she didn't write a diary entry. She didn't leave a private note. She called her personal solicitor to Althorpe in August of 1997. and drafted a formal legal memorandum. She chose Althorpe deliberately, Spencer family land, outside the reach of the royal archives, beyond the jurisdiction of the Lord Chamberlain's office. A document executed on private Spencer property and witnessed by two independent estate employees fell entirely under civil probate law, which meant the palace couldn't simply classify it as a royal paper and lock it inside Windsor for the next 100 years. Let me know in the comments section below. Not because she intended for him to read it immediately, but because she understood that the document could only be activated by someone with the institutional authority to enforce it, and that authority wouldn't belong to her son until he was old enough, senior enough, and positioned firmly enough inside the line of succession that the palace couldn't dismiss him. She sealed it with blue wax, pressed her signet ring into the wax while it was still warm, dropped the gold charm into the fold of the envelope, and handed everything to the one person she trusted to make the right call about timing. William drove back to London with the 3 vellum pages folded inside his jacket pocket. He didn't call his communications team. He didn't brief his private secretary. He went directly to his personal office at Kensington Palace and made a single phone call to a senior solicitor who had managed Diana's private trust since the late 1990s, and that person arrived within 45 minutes carrying a secure briefcase and no questions. William laid the 3 pages flat on his desk. The solicitor put on his reading glasses, scanned the text without speaking, and then pointed to the final paragraph on the 3rd sheet. He explained what William already suspected, but needed confirmed by someone with the authority to say it plainly. Diana hadn't written a personal letter. She had formally executed a legal memorandum in the presence of 2 independent witnesses whose signatures were clearly visible at the bottom of the page. The solicitor looked up and stated that the document was fully binding under English trust law. If William chose to enforce its terms, certain aspects of Camilla's current use of ceremonial assets connected to the Spencer estate would constitute an immediate legal violation. The palace couldn't override it. Parliament didn't need to be consulted. The Spencer trustees held the authority to act unilaterally. William listened. He thanked the solicitor. Then he asked him to prepare a single photocopied page, 1 page only, not 3, accompanied by a brief formal note on Kensington Palace letterhead. No demands, no ultimatum, no explanatory covering letter, just the page and the note confirming it had come from his office. He sent it to Clarence House by private courier that same afternoon. Queen Camilla was in her sitting room reviewing notes for a national television interview scheduled for the following morning when her private secretary brought the cream-colored envelope upstairs. She took it, recognized the Kensington Palace stamp, and used a silver letter opener to slide it open. She unfolded the single photocopied page and began reading. Her eyes moved down the text until they reached a section Diana had written in bold, deliberate strokes near the bottom of the sheet. 4 words, underlined twice. Camilla's hands dropped to her lap. She didn't call for her legal team immediately. She didn't demand an explanation from her staff. She sat completely still for a moment that several people in the corridor outside later described as unnervingly long. Then she stood, walked to her desk, and picked up the telephone. She told her chief of staff to contact the broadcasting network and cancel the morning interview. The reason given was a sudden scheduling conflict. At the television studio in central London, the executive producers received the news with barely concealed fury. The lighting grids had already been calibrated. The camera positions had been locked. Airtime had been cleared across the national network. A cancellation at less than 24 hours' notice from a senior royal isn't a scheduling conflict. Every veteran in that building knew it. Within the hour, journalists were calling their contacts inside the Lord Chamberlain's office, sensing the specific grammar of a palace emergency. Camilla's lawyers spent the rest of the evening searching for a flaw. They found one potential argument. The document William had sent was a photocopy. Without the original, its legal validity couldn't be formally verified. But Camilla already knew it was real. She had recognized Diana's handwriting before she finished the first line. Camilla's lawyers filed their preliminary argument with quiet confidence. The document William had sent was a photocopy. The original hadn't been presented, hadn't been examined, and hadn't been submitted to any formal archival or legal body for verification. Until the physical pages were produced and authenticated by an independent authority, the letter carried no enforceable constitutional weight. They drafted a holding statement to the High Court, prepared to classify the memorandum as an unverified draft with no legal standing. It was a reasonable defensive position. It lasted until midnight. William had anticipated it. Precisely at 10 o'clock that same evening, a private car cleared the security checkpoint at the Buckingham Palace gate under a high-priority clearance code issued directly from William's office. The passenger was a woman carrying a large leather scanning case. Dr. Elizabeth Vance, a retired senior forensic handwriting analyst who had spent the better part of 3 decades working with Scotland Yard on document authentication cases. She wasn't a palace employee. She had no institutional loyalty to either household. She was simply the most qualified person in the country for what William needed done before morning. By midnight, her equipment was humming on the mahogany table in William's private study. She had spent 2 hours working under ultraviolet light, analyzing the microgrooves of Diana's navy blue ink at a magnification level that revealed details invisible to the naked eye. William stood behind her, watching the display monitor without speaking. Dr. Vance clicked her mouse, zoomed into the final paragraph of the 3rd page, and began to explain what she was seeing. The indentation depth of the ink was entirely consistent with a standard Mont Blanc fountain pen from the mid-1990s. The paper stock carried a watermark from a specialist stationery manufacturer based in Gloucestershire that had gone permanently out of business in 1999, meaning the vellum itself couldn't have been sourced after that date. The 2 witness signatures at the bottom of page 3 showed identical ink depth and micro variation to the body of the text, confirming they had been applied in the same session on the same day with the same instrument. This wasn't a draft. It wasn't a modern forgery. It wasn't a piece of modified archival text. It was a fully executed legal document authenticated to the last fiber of its paper. Then Dr. Vance reached into her pocket and placed a small translucent evidence bag on the desk beside the vellum pages. Inside was the gold polo mallet charm. She explained that the oxidization pattern on the gold surface was entirely consistent with nearly 30 years of sealed storage in a dark, climate-controlled environment. The tarnishing was uniform, gradual, and impossible to artificially replicate without the kind of controlled aging process that would itself leave forensic traces. The charm had been there since the day the wax was poured. Dr. Vance packed her equipment, signed her formal report, and left before 1 o'clock in the morning. By 2 o'clock, an alert had reached Camilla's private tablet through the secure internal messaging system connecting the royal households. Kensington Palace had completed full forensic validation using an independent outside specialist. The primary line of defense had collapsed before the sun had even risen. The hotel dining room in Belgravia was empty at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, except for a single figure sitting by the window holding a porcelain teacup with both hands. She wore a simple dark wool coat and a strand of pearls. She didn't stand when William entered. She didn't offer a warm greeting or an explanation for why she had asked to meet him here rather than anywhere connected to either household. She simply pointed to the empty chair across from her and pushed a small velvet jewelry box across the white tablecloth. William sat down. He opened the box. Inside was a gold charm shaped like a polo mallet, identical in every detail to the one Dr. Vance had sealed inside an evidence bag less than 9 hours earlier. Lady Sarah McCorquodale, Princess Diana's eldest sister, co-executor of her original 1996 will, and one of the few people alive who had been present in the weeks immediately following Diana's death, looked at her nephew across the table and began to speak. She told him that she was the one who had placed the leather writing case inside the Althorpe filing cabinet in the spring of 1998. She had kept the master key in her personal safe for 28 years. The estate solicitor hadn't stumbled across the box during a routine administrative cleanup. He had found it because she had called him 3 days before William's visit and told him precisely where to look. The discovery wasn't an accident. It had never been an accident. Lady Sarah explained the timeline with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in her mind for a very long time. Following Diana's death, a team of palace lawyers had arrived at Kensington Palace within weeks to conduct an official inventory of her private papers. The operation was thorough and swift. Lady Sarah and her brother Charles had quietly intercepted several boxes of highly sensitive personal correspondence before the official team completed their sweep, not to hide the material from history, but to protect it from being buried inside the royal archives at Windsor, where it would remain classified and inaccessible for the next 100 years. She had kept Diana's leather writing case in her own custody because Diana had asked her to, specifically and personally, with one instruction attached: wait until the moment is right. Lady Sarah had watched from a careful distance as the years passed and the palace adjusted and Camilla's position within the household slowly consolidated. She hadn't acted during the turbulent early years after Diana's death, when emotions were too raw and the legal ground too unstable. She hadn't acted during the years when William was still finding his footing within the institution. She had waited with the particular patience of someone who understood that releasing a legal weapon at the wrong moment was the same as not having it at all. The trigger, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic. She had read a series of reports indicating that Camilla's office had begun a quiet administrative expansion, specifically an attempt to review the terms of the traditional Spencer family heirloom loans and audit the financial boundaries of the Duchy of Cornwall. The moment she understood what that expansion was reaching toward, she picked up the telephone and made the call. She kissed William on the cheek, stood up, adjusted her coat, and walked out of the hotel. The quiet conflict was no longer just about jewelry and old letters. Somewhere across the city, the king had already sent word that he wanted his son at Windsor before nightfall. William arrived at Windsor Castle at precisely 1 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. The sovereign's drawing room was bright with the kind of cold, clear light that cuts through Gothic windows in early spring, laying long rectangles of pale gold across the carpet and making everything in the room look older and more formal than it actually was. King Charles sat in a high-backed armchair near the marble fireplace with a tartan blanket across his knees. Queen Camilla stood by the writing desk near the window, her chief of staff positioned directly behind her left shoulder. Sitting at the low coffee table between them was the head of the privy purse, a leather ledger of the sovereign's private estate financials open across his lap. William didn't take a seat. He walked to the center of the room, unzipped his leather briefing case, and placed the original 3 vellum pages of Diana's memorandum flat on the polished surface of the coffee table. Beside them, he laid the 2 matching gold polo mallet charms side by side without explanation. He looked at his father and stated the position plainly. The document had been forensically verified by Scotland Yard's former senior analyst less than 12 hours prior. The ink, the paper stock, the witness signatures all authenticated beyond legal challenge. The Spencer family trustees were prepared to file a public injunction before the end of the day if the terms of the memorandum weren't formally met. The head of the privy purse picked up the vellum pages. His hands weren't entirely steady. He read the final clause on the 3rd sheet, set the pages down, and looked at King Charles. He confirmed what William's solicitor had already established. The document fell entirely under civil probate law. The palace held no royal prerogative to suppress or reclassify it. The Spencer trustees needed neither parliamentary approval nor the king's consent to proceed. Camilla's financial counterargument, the parallel mechanism her lawyers had spent the previous night constructing, a technical arrangement within the sovereign's private estate accounts that her team had intended to present through the privy purse as a legal offset against the Spencer trust claims, dissolved in the silence that followed. There was nothing left to present. William laid out his terms. 2 conditions, both non-negotiable. Camilla's office would sign a formal binding declaration renouncing any future administrative oversight of the Duchy of Cornwall finances, and the specific Spencer heirlooms currently held in the palace vaults would be physically returned to Althorpe House before the summer retreat. There would be no negotiation on either point, and no timeline extension. Charles looked at the gold charms on the table for a long moment. Then, he looked at his son. He didn't defend his wife. He didn't dispute the document. He turned to the head of the privy purse and instructed him to draft the necessary executive orders immediately. Then he told Camilla, quietly and without elaboration, that the administrative expansion of her office had gone further than the traditional boundaries of the household permitted, and that those boundaries would now be restored. Camilla picked up a silver fountain pen from the writing desk, walked to the coffee table, and signed. She walked out through the private side door without a word. Her chief of staff followed. The room was silent, and across the city, the press had already begun to notice that something was wrong. The television studio in central London had been ready since 6 that morning. The lighting grids were calibrated, the camera positions were locked, the broadcast slot had been cleared across the national network for what had been promoted internally as an exclusive and wide-ranging conversation with the Queen. The executive producer had been managing royal media appearances for more than 2 decades, and he had spent the previous week coordinating with Clarence House on everything from the precise angle of the main camera to the temperature of the room. When the red telephone from the palace rang and the cancellation was delivered, he stood in the middle of the studio floor for a moment without speaking. Then he demanded a direct explanation. The Clarence House press liaison could only offer a scheduling conflict. Nobody in that building believed it. A senior royal doesn't cancel a nationally cleared broadcast at less than 24 hours' notice because of a scheduling conflict. In the grammar of palace communications, that kind of cancellation means one thing, and one thing only. Something has gone fundamentally wrong behind closed doors, and the household needs time to manage it before putting a senior member in front of a camera and a live microphone. The technical crew began quietly dismantling the set. The executive producer picked up his own telephone and started making calls. By midday, fragments of the story had reached 3 major newspapers simultaneously. Not through an official leak, not through a coordinated briefing, but through the connective tissue of palace adjacency. The assistants, the drivers, the junior secretaries, the retired advisors, who each knew one piece of something, and none of whom knew the whole picture. The canceled interview was the first visible thread, and once journalists began pulling it, the shape of what lay beneath started to emerge. Diana's name appeared in the early afternoon. The word letter appeared an hour later. By early evening, the phrase hidden document was moving across social media faster than any press office could contain. The palace issued a single statement, 4 sentences confirming that certain private family matters were being handled internally and that no further comment would be forthcoming at this time. It satisfied nobody. In the specific vocabulary of royal crisis management, a statement that says nothing is understood by every experienced correspondent to be confirmation that something significant has occurred, because a household with nothing to hide doesn't deploy the phrase private family matters. Royal historians appearing on evening television pointed out something that stopped several of their interviewers mid-sentence. In the nearly 30 years since Diana's death, not a single private legal document bearing her name had ever been formally activated against the palace. Letters had surfaced. Diaries had been referenced. Interviews had aired. But a legally executed memorandum, forensically verified and enforced through the Spencer family trust structure, that had never happened, not once. The precedent was without modern parallel. Public opinion divided almost immediately. And it divided in the way that anything connected to Diana always divides sharply, emotionally, and along lines that had been forming for decades. One side saw William as his mother's son, protecting a legacy the institution had spent 30 years trying to quietly absorb. The other asked a harder question, whether deploying a private letter written by a woman who had been dead since 1997 served anyone's dignity, including hers. Neither side was entirely wrong, and the palace, still silent, offered nothing to resolve the tension. 3 days after the sovereign's drawing room fell silent, Camilla appeared in public for the first time. The engagement was a scheduled garden party at the Royal Horticultural Society in Chelsea, a long-standing fixture in the royal calendar, attended that afternoon by the King, the Queen, and the Prince of Wales. It was exactly the kind of appearance that palace communications teams describe as routine, seasonal, unremarkable, the kind of event where the primary function of every senior royal present is to smile at the right moment, shake the correct number of hands, and give the cameras nothing they didn't intend to give them. But the cameras, as they always do, saw more than they were meant to. The arrival sequence is where royal body language speaks most clearly. Before the formal greetings begin, before the practiced smiles lock into place. In the 3 or 4 seconds when people are simply moving from one place to another and haven't yet arranged themselves for public consumption, something was different, not dramatically, not in a way that a casual observer would immediately name, but different in the precise, deliberate way that everything inside a royal public appearance is deliberate. Camilla walked one step behind, not beside Charles, not at his shoulder in the position her office had spent the better part of 2 years establishing as the default configuration for joint appearances. One step behind and slightly to the left, the positioning that, within the internal hierarchy of palace protocol, communicates a specific and unmistakable message to anyone who understands the language. William walked to his father's right. The greeting line lasted approximately 40 minutes. Hundreds of guests moved through it in the warm afternoon light, shaking hands, exchanging the brief pleasantries that these occasions require, holding their programs a little too tightly, and trying not to stare. A veteran royal photographer who had been covering palace engagements for more than 30 years stood at the far end of the garden and worked his way through frame after frame of the afternoon. He would note afterward, in a private conversation with a colleague, that in 140 frames taken across the full duration of the event, Queen Camilla and the Prince of Wales were never photographed standing side by side. Not once. In every frame where both of them appeared, there was always someone between them, a guest, a host, a member of staff, or one of them had their back partially turned. It wasn't accidental. Nothing at an event like this is accidental. There was one moment, approximately halfway through the greeting line, where Camilla and William came face to face. He extended his hand. She took it. The handshake lasted exactly the correct number of seconds. Not a fraction longer, not a fraction shorter. She smiled. He smiled. The cameras captured it from 4 different angles, and every image showed 2 people performing the specific public fluency that the royal family has refined across generations. The ability to stand inside a moment of profound private tension and give the watching world absolutely nothing to confirm what it already suspects. Nobody in that garden needed to know the details of what had happened inside Windsor Castle. The afternoon had already told them everything. The basement vault at Althorpe was empty now. The steel table where the leather writing case had rested for nearly 3 decades stood bare under the bare bulb of the ceiling light. The scarred leather case itself had been moved to the Spencer family's formal legal archive, cataloged under a reference number known only to the trustees, and placed inside a climate-controlled unit that would preserve the contents for the next generation of historians who would eventually be allowed to read what Diana had actually written across those 3 vellum pages. The room smelled of stone and old air. There was nothing left to find, but it was the right place to end. What William had done was simpler and more precise than most people would understand. He had enforced a legal boundary that Diana had constructed specifically because she understood that legal boundaries, unlike emotional appeals, cannot be ignored by an institution trained to wait out grief. She hadn't written those 3 pages in anger. She had written them in clarity, in the specific, cold-eyed clarity of a woman who had spent 15 years learning exactly how the palace operated and had decided in her final weeks to use that knowledge one last time on behalf of the people she was leaving behind. What William gained from the confrontation was not simply the return of certain heirlooms or the restriction of Camilla's administrative reach. Those were the visible outcomes, the things that could be documented, verified, and reported. What he gained beneath those outcomes was something harder to quantify and considerably more durable. He had demonstrated, without a press conference and without a single public statement, that he held a category of authority within the family that his stepmother's team couldn't replicate or neutralize. The moral weight of a mother's documented wishes, forensically authenticated and legally enforced, is not a weapon that can be confiscated or redirected. It simply exists for as long as William chooses to hold it. What Camilla lost was not her title and not her public standing, both of which remained formally intact. What she lost was the administrative momentum her office had been quietly building, the slow, patient expansion of institutional footprint that is how power actually moves inside a structure like the British monarchy. Not through dramatic announcements, but through the gradual redrawing of boundaries that most people never notice until they have already shifted. That expansion had been stopped, and the stopping of it had been witnessed by every senior figure inside the household, which meant that restarting it would carry a cost that hadn't previously existed. What Charles protected was the monarchy itself, its appearance of stability, its ability to absorb a crisis without rupturing publicly. He had done it at a personal cost that no official record would ever formally acknowledge, and that the cameras at Chelsea would partially document without ever being able to fully explain. And Diana, a woman who had been dead for nearly 30 years, who had written 3 pages by hand in a private house in August of 1997, who had sealed them with blue wax and placed a gold charm inside the fold of the envelope, and trusted her eldest sister to know when the time had come. Diana had protected her son's future from beyond the reach of the institution that had spent decades trying to define what her legacy meant and who was allowed to carry it. She had written the letter before the internet existed, before William was old enough to understand what she was building, before anyone inside the palace believed she was capable of thinking that far ahead. It turned out she had always been thinking that far ahead. They simply hadn't been paying attention.